Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Joining us from Princeton, we have Professor Samuel Holzman, who is an archaeologist and an architectural historian specializing in Greek and Greece and Anatolia from the early Iron Age through the Hellenistic period. His research is deeply rooted in archaeological fieldwork and the technical study of ancient building methods. His forthcoming book, Bilingual Ionic Column Capitals Perceptions of the Past in Greek Architecture, which is in production with Princeton University Press right now, explores how Greek temple builders engaged with earlier architectural forms in their designs. Sam Holtzman's recent publications highlight engineering innovations and structural daring in ancient stone construction, including studies on the lifting devices used by ancient builders. His architectural research interests span ancient aesthetic theories of architecture, particularly in the works of Vitruvius and Hermogenes, quantitative analysis of labor and transportation logistics in monumental construction, ancient construction tools, in structural technologies, architectural polychromy, and the modern reception of ancient architecture. Among many other things, Sam Holzman leads the architectural research team on the American excavations at Samothrace, where each summer selected students from our school have the opportunity to participate in fieldwork. And there are three very lucky students. Hopefully, all three are here in the audience. Yes, very good. Today, Professor Holzman will discuss a pivotal invention in the history of construction, the flat arch. This structural device combines the load distributing advantages of the arch with the trabeated post and lintel aesthetic characteristic of Greek architecture. Today's lecture, Structural Innovation Between Athens, Samothrace, and Rome, will explore how this innovation shaped architectural developments that anticipated the widespread adoption of the true arch in Roman architecture. Please welcome Professor Holzman to the podium.
Alessandro, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's customary for speakers to begin a talk by thanking the hosting institution and saying it's a pleasure to be here. But I wanted to begin today by actually telling you why I'm so excited to be here at Notre Dame and the architectural school in particular, which is that over the last several years, we have brought young architects from Notre Dame with us into the field. And these include Margot Holberg and Selma Panic, Abby Mayer, Caleb Braille. I've thrown Elise Williams onto here, an Emory graduate who is now here at Notre Dame. And right. And you know, and I was pleased to see that our Stoa is in your Stoa when I was in the library. And so, in a way, my presentation today is in part a kind of report on what your students get up to in the summers. I was in the taxi here yesterday evening, and the taxi driver said, oops, let me knock over the podium, said, are you giving a lecture? And I said, no, I'm a talent recruiter. So we're very grateful that you send us your students, and I'm looking forward to another productive season. Another reason that I'm so pleased to be here is Alessandro is an inspiration to me, particularly his work with the Isha Lab and modeling the Tomb of Building is a model of collaboration between architects, structural engineers, and archaeologists to use structural analysis, empirical analytical methods to answer historical problems that interest archaeologists. And this is an important model of collaboration. And I'm going to show you some results of a similar collaborative project that we've been working on this year at Princeton. Okay, let me get down to the basics. You all know this. Stone is a very strong material under compression, but it is a weak material in tension, 1/10 as strong. Ancient builders make post and lintel construction look easy. Here is the Portara of Naxos, the gateway of a temple that has stood for 2.5 millennia. I show you the gateway to a Stephen Hall building at Princeton, built a couple of years ago, that has cracked under its own weight within a few years of construction. This is the product of architects who are so used to working with reinforced concrete that has different tensile capabilities. The oldest trick in the book was to just take the weight off of stone lintels. We see this in Mycenaean architecture using corbelled construction. We see this in the temples of Asia Minor, where there was a phenomenon of putting windows in the pediments of temples. Of course, there are many theories about the potential cultic implications of these windows, but from a structural perspective, they certainly didn't hurt. Ultimately, we see the widespread solution of putting arches over beams. Arches we're so used to thinking of as being semicircular in design, but arches can be deformed into many shapes. They can become pointed, horseshoe-shaped, etc., though this affects the amount of lateral force that they can produce, and they can be deformed into flat constructions, the flat arch known as plate-bande in French, or the shallow jack arch. And this is a widespread feature of Roman building. It has been extensively studied as a feature of Roman architecture beginning in the Renaissance. Travelers to Rome noted this construction in the standing ruins of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, where the jagged trapezoidal blocks of the frieze give that ruin its distinctive jagged silhouette, a building much admired both as a model of the Corinthian order and as a structural paradigm of Roman ingenuity, of combining the load-bearing potential of the arch with the trabeated aesthetics of Greek architecture. There are other surviving examples of this. I show you Da Vinci's study of the Colonna di San Lorenzo in Milan in his sketchbooks, diagramming out this ancient structural technique. And builders of the early modern period experimented with its implications. Giulio Romano at the Palazzo Te teases at the way the artifice inherent in this construction technique, where the post and lintel forms of the Doric order are in fact concealing a structural system that works in a different way. And here that facade of artifice falls away as the triglyph keystones seem to drop out of their position. Of course, its own artifice rendered in plaster over a perfectly stable brick wall. Giulio Romano's source of inspiration for this was the Basilica Emilia in Rome, which was then still partly standing. We have now only individual blocks of its distinctive wedge-shaped frieze, and this is probably also the inspiration for Andrea Palladio's Palazzo Caricati in Vicenza, where you can see this form that I'm going to talk about today, replicated at large scale in Vicenza. In the mid-18th century, when Marc-Antoine Laugier, the remarkable architectural reformer, tries to establish a new system of classicizing aesthetics based on Hellenic architectural forms, he grapples with the problem of the flat arch. He rejects the arcade, so popular as an architectural form, because it seems to him illogical, because arches generate lateral thrust, which columns cannot resist. And so he rules out the use of arcades in his vision of an ideal architecture, and in preference for trabeated systems of post and lintels. But after saying this, he then has a concession where he says, putting flat arches over columns, that's totally fine, which you might think is a contradiction to his way of thinking. Of course, he cites, and he's looking at Claude Perrault's colonnade of the Louvre, which he held as sort of the epitome of his architectural ambitions. But in this, which is shot through at every level with flat arch construction, in all of the courses, in the coffered ceilings, etc. But here is an inherent concession or compromise inside of the propagation of classicism in Europe in the early modern period, which is that many architects sought to borrow from the forms of Greek and Roman architecture, but few of them wanted to recreate the ordeal of megalithic construction. And so this allowed one to build with smaller stones and to make structures that were less risky, less dependent on single structural members. And so this form is key to the spread of classicism in the early modern period. I saw this morning and couldn't resist throwing in a slide. It may be a form familiar to you from, I suppose, yes, one Stoa for another. Even modernist architecture that has stripped away all of the culturally contingent classical idioms of historicizing ornament have borrowed this form of flat arches, here rendered as thin stone veneers applied to a structure of reinforced concrete as a visual reference to the monumentality of Greco-Roman antiquity. Our perception of Greek architecture is particularly shaped by paradigms that are produced really in the infancy of archaeological research into Greek architecture. And I think here particularly of Karl Bodeker's tectonics of the Greeks, which solidified a way of thinking about Greek versus Roman architecture. Kerr argued that the Greek orders are an art form, a kunst form, that is an elaboration in all its elements of a core tectonic form, a kern form. The idea that all of the ornament and all of the decoration of Greek architecture serves the purpose of illustrating the post and lintel structure that it is. And this paradigm that the architecture of the Greeks is really essentially a very long footnote to the story of post and lintel construction, and that everything else really belongs to the Roman world, is a paradigm that took shape before much investigation of major Greek temples, and yet it still shapes how we think. And so I'd like to shake this up a little bit by illustrating a very early introduction of a form that we've generally assumed to be a product of the Roman world. So, let me take you to the Greek island of Samothrace, located here in the northeast corner of the Aegean Sea. Seeing it on a map, it looks tiny and insignificant, but it is much more useful for you to keep in mind where it is on the horizon. Here seen from the marble quarries on the south of the island of Thasos, the Mount Saus, or Mount Fangari, which rises a mile high, is one of the most important navigational benchmarks in the northern Aegean. This island hosts a sanctuary where local gods, the great gods of Samothrace, were worshipped in a mystery cult, a cult of initiation, where we were let into secrets, including the names of these gods, during nocturnal initiation ceremonies. And this sanctuary, which has been excavated by an American team based at NYU and Emory University since 1938, the sanctuary that you see here took shape in the early Hellenistic period, and it is the product of an expansion. Here is our rendering of the site that is bookended by two major world historical events that happened right here at this site. In the 450s BC, Philip and Olympias, the king and queen of Macedon, met and arranged their marriage. These are the parents of Alexander the Great. Because of this connection, those who followed Alexander and who wished to stake a claim to his legacy made elaborate dedications in this sanctuary, and it became a kind of official sanctuary for the kingdom of Macedon, and that kingdom comes to a crashing end here in the early 2nd century BC, when Perseus, the last king of Macedon, defeated by the Roman general Aemilius Paulus at the Battle of Pydna, rushes off to take refuge in this sanctuary and is dragged out of it kicking and screaming by Gnaeus Octavius to be led in triumph in Rome. And these two events bookend a kind of 200-year period of intensive building that transforms the sanctuary you see reconstructed here. These include some landmarks of the history of architecture. The propylon built by Ptolemy II has our first structural Corinthian order on the facade of a building. You will all know the Lysicrides monument. Here is a proper hexastyle Doric Corinthian facade for the first time. The rotunda, built by Arsinoe II, Ptolemy II's sister and also wife, is the largest round building of the Greek world, with a span of about 16 meters. Relegated to the western boundary of the sanctuary is our largest building, which has not to this point been a focus of extensive attention, in part because it's not a beautiful marble structure and because it's not as well preserved. The Dolomitic limestone has been disintegrating. It's porous and water soluble, but it has been hiding some secret from us this whole time. It was first investigated in the 1870s by the German Prussian archaeologists working for an Austrian team, Alexander Kunze. It was then systematically excavated by Jim McCready of NYU in the 1960s and early 1970s, and since 2017 has been a focus of our research, drawing and measuring architectural blocks and working on reconstruction drawings. And I'm going to show you the product of that research here. In terms of what is this building for and what's it doing, it's useful to remember Vitruvius's advice that one should attach to a theater, a stoa, so that audiences have a place to escape to when it rains, and that choruses have a rehearsal venue. Of course, this isn't just an emergency rain shelter. This is the essential support space for hosting large festivals. I show you Vitruvius's two reference points, the Portico and Theater Pompey in Rome and the Stoa of Eumenes and Theater of Dionysus in Athens, together with the Stoa and Theater on Samothrace at the same scale. This building became a kind of informal archive of initiates who visited the sanctuary. People who came to Samothrace signed their names, often on marble blocks. Here you will see this formula of Epibasileus in the priesthood of the king priest is how they date the inscriptions, and then they list their names, appending Eusebes Mistes, the highest initiate, to their names. And we see this scratched into the plaster on the back wall. Somebody figured out that if they keyed their name through the red paint, they could expose the white mortar below and make a really eye-catching inscription, and everybody else copied them. I was asked today in my meeting with students about, does this count as graffiti? And I think it's useful to keep in mind an inscription from Miletus that records decree discouraging people from leaving their votives and attaching them to the columns of the new stoa, not to affix their votives to the columns or to the woodwork of the building, but to attach it to the plastered back wall of the structure. This push and pull between the priests who controlled the sanctuary and the people who used the buildings, and a kind of grudging compromise of where people could write their names on these buildings as tokens of devotion. We have been engaged in piecing this building back together again through carefully looking at its 1,700 preserved blocks, none of which are in place above the level of the stylobate. And in the process of measuring these blocks carefully, we noticed that our frieze blocks are not straight, but in fact have battered lateral joints. This is one of our triglyph metope triglyph blocks. And if you look at this block from the back, you will see that it takes the shape of the keystone of an arch. And our metope triglyph metope blocks from this frieze are battered the other way in the shape of a springer for an arch. One of the other features that caught my attention is that all of these keystone blocks have a cutting for a Lewis iron. That is a point where you would attach a fitting for a crane or block and tackle to lift this vertically and put it into place, something not evident on the complementary blocks. And this was during COVID, and I had a Zoom with Professor Piratini, and I said, "You'll never guess what I found." And he said, "Did you check if the keystone blocks are the same height as the Springer blocks?" And I said, "I hadn't thought of that." And I went and I looked at our little database, and he was absolutely right. Our keystone blocks are 1 centimeter shorter than the Springer blocks on either side, so that they could be assembled with a very thin air gap underneath them. Something like this. And I've made a little 3D printed model. I can toggle this back and forth with my Lewis iron. And I made a plaster cast of this so that afterward you can come up here and play with it, or I suppose learn from it through tactile engagement. And I'll leave it here with Professor Piratini for you to continue to play with afterward. I know that you learn from models here in the architecture school. Actually, I'm a little bit cheating in this representation because they weren't lowering these keystones into place the way you would perhaps in the construction of a regular arch, because actually at the ends of our Springer blocks, we have an end dowel, which is a clear sign that they've shoved this block in horizontally and then doweled it into place so that it doesn't slip back. And this is an indication that actually what they're doing is they're putting two blocks into position at the same time. They're using this Lewis iron in the keystone to essentially hold it up and then slide the block in next to it to secure the joint. And so they're building arches in sequence, moving left to right, which is not usually how you would assemble them. But here they've rigged up a system to do this as efficiently as possible. Okay, so why do they do this in this building on Samothrace and not our other Doric buildings? Well, one of the key indications from this comes from a kind of proportional analysis of these structures, which you will see all of our major cult buildings have the formal, traditional, archaic form of having, two metopes and two triglyphs per bay. But our Stoa jumps to this slightly later form that becomes popular at the end of the 5th century, the 4th century, and becomes standard in Stoas for expanding the bay with an extra triglyph and metope. In order not to overextend it, they've shrunk the entablature down, with the result that our architrave beams are the most attenuated of any of the Doric buildings at this site. In order to cover more ground, they have stretched out the column base, and they have also downgraded their use of material to a locally accessible Feli limestone. But this caused this trade-off, this saving in expenses, in materials and transportation costs, came with other costs, concerns about the structural integrity of their beams, and this is where they inject the solution of relieving devices. Now, we can see that Greek builders were experimenting with relieving devices starting in the 5th century. The most remarkable of these begins with the Propylaea, the gateway to the Athenian Acropolis, which is our first major building with one of these expanded Doric bays with an extra triglyph and metope. And what the architect Messicles has done in order to take weight off this extended beam that covered the central passage of processions up to the Acropolis was to form the frieze course out of blocks that are as large as the beams that they are on top of, and which are undercut below very slightly to produce two huge cantilevered blocks, and they hid the joint in the middle with a little plaque that covered this central metope. This is a sort of a key structural solution using cantilevers to cover this single bay. At the end of the 4th century, we see Athenian builders continuing on with this solution. In the square peristyle, a building thought to be the law courts of ancient Athens. This takes that solution from the single central bay of the Propylaea, and it multiplies it over every single bay, where every bay of that building is covered by frieze blocks that are a double cantilever. They're cantilevered on both sides, and they have a single floating metope that rests on two ledges on either side in a structural form in stone that in some ways represents a structural antecedent for the Gerber beams that are so common in modern construction, though here executed in stone. And this building is built just a generation before the Stoa on Samothrace. And so I think this sequence of buildings shows us ancient structural thinking and a key moment of innovation, where in the period between sort of about 25 to 50 years after the death of Alexander the Great, there is considerable experimentation with relieving devices and ultimately the hitting on a solution that will last for centuries. And so I'm curious to get inside of this idea and why this switch occurs. We have some sense of ancient structural thinking from writers like Vitruvius. Vitruvius gives us his rule of thumb for how to space columns. When he's describing his preferred column spaces, he likes eustyle, which is columns are spaced 2 and 2 1/4 times the diameter of the columns apart. But if you get to diastyle where you've got 3-column diameters, he says you have the risk of the columns breaking because of the gap in the intercolumniations. And our Stoa fits really comfortably in this spacing with a spacing of 2 3/5. Of course, Vitruvius's solution doesn't take account for scale, right? This isn't a problem if you're building columns that are 15 feet tall. And if you're building columns 50 feet tall, it's never going to work. That scale is the key problem in these structural situations. He does offer some suggestions about scaling architraves, but it is about the aesthetics of correcting for perspectival diminution, that every 5 feet taller your columns get, you should increase the height of the architrave by between 4 and 5% in a rather convoluted system of proportions that he gives us, though this is purely for aesthetic purposes and not intended primarily as structural mitigation. The other idea that's floating around, and which I think is important to understanding how builders passed on ideas through trial and error, through experimentation, and through word of mouth, is stories about building collapses. And this is a record actually buried in Theophrastus's On Plants, which is a sort of key early treatise on botany. He's telling us about different types of wood, and he tells us about a building that fell down. As to sweet chestnut, which grows tall and is used for roofing, it is said that when it is about to split, it makes a noise so that men are forewarned. This occurred once at Andros at the baths, and all those present rushed out. Right? Here's a kind of story about a thankfully fatality-less building collapse and the way in which these stories of structures that failed and lessons learned were passed on between builders. It also contains, I think, an important reference to the idea of fail-safes in architecture, that we're surrounded by fail-safes today, structural systems, electric systems that use fuse breakers, for example, or the drivetrains of automobiles that have shear pins, that have sort of devices that are designed so that when they fail, this system will fail in a way that limits damage or danger. And this idea of using wooden beams that emit a sound when they begin to deform is a way of making safe buildings. And I think this idea of fail-safes is key to understanding the integration of things like relieving devices into buildings. I've begun analyzing this structure with a team of engineers at Princeton, led by the chair of our civil engineering department, Branko Blisic, as well as a postdoc who now teaches at the University of Bologna, Antonio Maria D'Altri, and a recent graduate of our program, Johnny Gagnon, who analyzed this structure for his senior thesis using numerical modeling and finite element analysis. And he modeled these two colonnades, the square peristyle with its system of relieving devices based on cantilevered blocks, and the Stoa with its flat arches. And the results are illuminating. The first observation here, and this diagram shows us tensile stress measured in megapascals, is that actually the spacing of the blocks themselves, without relieving devices at all, just modeled as the blocks set on the beams, having large frieze blocks actually already functions a bit like a cantilever. So without relieving devices, these longer frieze blocks relieve some weight from the beams initially, simply in the division of the blocks. The integration here now with the relieving devices added in significantly drops the amount of pressure that these blocks are under by about one third of the pressure that they're under. And you'll see, in fact, that the results show that these relieving devices are essentially equally effective in the amount of weight that they take off of the beams below, simply looking at the efficiency as it relates to the architrave block. But what you'll see here is that the relieving device, based on these double cantilevers, produces a new problem, which is up here. That is that they have taken the bending stress that the beam is under, and they've reduced that, but they have greatly increased the amount of stress that these frieze blocks are under. These double cantilevered blocks are under more stress than any block was in the system without anything going on. And so they've created blocks that are on the verge of cracking through this form. And it may be the potential failure of these structures that push architects away from this system. The other thing that this revealed is that the amount of forces that these systems are under are well within the structural capacity of stone. These structures would stand without these relieving devices. These appear to be primarily designed as fail-safes, that if you had a beam that would break, the structure above might not instantly collapse, and that you could come in and repair it more carefully. The phenomenon of the flat arch shows up then in Rome in the first century BC. And it becomes particularly prominent in Roman imperial buildings. First in Rome with the Temple of Castor and Pollux and the Temple of Mars Ultor, a little bit earlier in the late Republic with the Temple of Portunus, and it propagates from the city of Rome in the Augustan era to other building projects. We see it in the West at the Maison Carrée and the Temple at Évora in Portugal. If we go to the East, we see it in many of the structures at sites like Palmyra. And we can follow this sort of trajectory. Here's our late Republican Temple of Portunus in the early first century BC, followed by these major large-scale building projects under Augustus, followed by dissemination to the Roman provinces, and ultimately also the widespread adoption of this building technique in Greek sanctuaries under Roman rule at sites like major temples like the Temple of Apollo at Didyma and the Temple of Trajan at Pergamon. You can see, I think, from this comparative diagram that in Roman construction, we see two things happen. One, this structural system is scaled up to much larger structures, that they're putting this on top of 60-foot tall columns rather than just 20-foot tall columns like we have on Samothrace. The other thing that they do is they push the line where they push the joint between the keystone and the springer to the point where all loads are taken off of the architrave beams below, which is not something that they're up to in our Stoa. The weight of the structure above this is still partly falling onto the span. And so what we're seeing here is a move to create greater efficiency, ultimately to the point where the beams are now redundant to the structure. Another feature that we see is that when this system of construction is adopted at Greek sites in the Roman world, there is careful attention always to hide it. So here you see, for example, the Temple of Trajan at Pergamon, where they have, even in a continuous Ionic frieze over a Corinthian colonnade, they have made these little lips so that the joint lines between the frieze blocks are always straight. In our buildings in Rome, there was no such concern. Putting an arch over a beam represented technological prowess and strength in construction. And in the Greek world, there was a kind of lingering conservatism, a sense that these cattywampus joints were a discordant note in the rectilinear harmony of the orders, and a concern with always concealing this. The way that we see it done on Samothrace, hidden behind the overlap of the triglyph and the beams next to it. Okay, so I think we're confronted here with a kind of problem about the transmission of structural ideas in the ancient world. I think I've convincingly shown the presence of this in our building on Samothrace, which was built in the second quarter of the 3rd century BCE, and we don't see it in Rome until the 1st century BC. So, what happened? How do ideas move around? And so I see 3 potential possibilities going on. The first of these is that we need not resort to models of diffusion to answer all questions. It could be that novel builders who understood the structural potential of arches and the problems of building with large stone beams invented this system at multiple times in ancient architecture, independently discovered in Rome, rather than necessarily transmitting it from the Greek world. But it's important to put this in structural context. While this Stoa is being built at a moment when the sanctuary on Samothrace thrived, builders in Rome are only beginning to experiment with temples that have stone superstructures. We don't have the remains of many of these buildings surviving, but as Penelope Davies has illustrated, we can see a switch at the very beginning of the 3rd century with the Temple of Victoria on the Palatine, where we have foundations for a temple with much more closely spaced columns, which shows a transition from superstructures of wood to superstructures of stone and sort of Greek aesthetics with densely spaced columns. So our Stoa is being built just as builders in Rome are experimenting with temples with stone superstructures. Sort of option 2 is that builders are importing this from the Greek world and may even be looking to Samothrace. Samothrace became a really important pilgrimage site for the Romans. Beginning in the 2nd century BC, the great gods of Samothrace are equated with the penates of Rome, the gods brought by Dardanus to Troy and from Troy to Rome by Aeneas. And there is this sort of lineage to the gods of Rome that are connected to Samothrace, and it becomes an important pilgrimage spot. And we see in the Middle Republican architecture of Rome connections even to the sanctuary on Samothrace. The Temple of Hercules Victor, for example, has this ornamental masonry pattern that we have on the Huron at Samothrace quite closely replicated. So there are some plausible connections for direct transmission, though it's important to point out that builders on Samothrace took great precaution to completely hide their tracks and make this an invisible structural feature. And so that leads me to the 3rd possibility, which is that this is a structural feature in Greek architecture that was more widely spread, and that we simply haven't seen what we're not looking for. The first person to sit down and draw the blocks of our Stoa was a French architect in the 1860s. And because we've not thought of this as a Greek building technique, we've not been looking for it. And there are other buildings out there that could be candidates for study. This is the Stoa of Sostratus at Cnidus, the architect of the great lighthouse in the harbor of Alexandria, one of the chief architects for Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. And you'll see in amongst its ruin those distinctive metope triglyph metope blocks. Here is the basilica on the island of Paros, which is completely built out of the spoliated remains, the blocks of the public buildings of the Agora of Paros. And you will see this sort of parapet in the church is made out of these blocks that have had their triglyphs cut off, but you will see the pattern of their spacing is a quite distinctive feature. And so I suspect that there may be more examples of this out there that are waiting to be found. And my conclusion, I suppose, is to say that hunting season is open, and that the chapter of the history of classical architecture that is about structural ideas and structural innovation, the last word of that has not yet been written. And although Alessandro and I are hard at work on it, there are discoveries waiting to be made out there for enterprising students who know how to draw. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Right.
Hi, great talk. I really enjoyed it. Earlier, you were talking about cantilevers built into the blocks of the flat arch. Oh, God, I want to say in the Athenian Acropolis, but I could be wrong. Do you know what the structural purpose of those cantilevers was?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, this is the worst part of a presentation where you skip back through all the slides. Okay, here we go. I think it's totally the same purpose, right? That they have, this is our propylaea, where they have widened the central bay. And in fact, the concern of this build, I mean, this is the first time they did it, when they said, okay, let's break from convention and this sort of standard spacing of triglyphs, open things up and create this sort of admittedly gap-toothed colonnade, but that was considerably more efficient in funneling your procession up to the Acropolis. And so Mnesocles stretches out the Doric order. And ultimately, this would become, as are other features of this building, like a standard approach to classical design. And you can see echoes of concern about this throughout the building. And sort of the first major one of these is to make the frieze over this central bay out of these huge blocks, that are just as big as the beams underneath them. And then sort of, next to that, the next block's just got a triglyph on it and then a metope and so on. And they space them out made out of small blocks. So it's absolutely about relieving the weight from the central bay. There are some other relieving devices that are hidden in here. They have actually a sort of a window over the major door lintel that's hidden above the coffered ceiling. And they were also concerned that the central block of the pediment that's on top of this might tip out. So it sort of has wings and it sits on top of the adjacent blocks of the pediment so that it's not going to tip forward if, you can see sort of all of these efforts to mitigate risk stemming from a single design choice that was ultimately a really successful one. I hope that answers your question.
On the slide when you were demonstrate or illustrating the assembly with the keystone and the lift and the notches, did you find notches on both sides to indicate that they were, like, building towards the center, or was it linear left to right?
This is really interesting. And this is, I'm going to train the students who are coming with me this summer to sort of know, based on where you see the dowel hole, which direction they're putting the block in. Right? If you have it on one end of the stone, that's the end that they're wedging in. And so we're keeping track of in our building, which way they're assembling it, because it tells us something about the history of the teams of builders, how many people worked on this. And so they are not sort of squishing the keystone from each side, but they're sort of building one bay, and then they put the next keystone in place, and I got a model. Come on. That they are, assembling the bays one by one, and they're dropping in the keystone, and they're putting in the next block in order, and they're continuing on in the sequence. But we do see that they change directions. And so what's fun about this is that we actually see them assembling both the architrave and the frieze course from north to south from the north end, and then from south to north at the south end of the building, to sort of as two teams work to meet in the middle. They actually didn't meet in the middle. That's sort of 60% of the way to the south. One team was evidently faster than the other team, and they sort of don't meet quite in the middle. But this idea of you've got a building that's 300 feet long, and so you have multiple teams working in multiple areas. And we also see, when they got to the cornice, where two teams met, we've got that intersection in the cornice as they're, these tools for lifting the stones with block and tackle, where you put essentially a Lewis iron that's in the shape of an inverted wedge into the block to lift it with a stone. I mean, they're lifting everything, the column drums, etc. But they only take this measure of cutting a channel into the block to lift it for particular stones that they need to put into place. And since these keystone blocks are half of our Lewis iron cuttings in the building. And so actually, because otherwise you just wrap the stone in ropes and you put it in place and you take the ropes off and you slide it. And they did that in the cornice. And then once they got to the last one, we've got just like a little tiny sliver of a cornice block with a cutting for Lewis iron that they dropped in the middle. And so, yeah, you can totally see the construction story by looking at these dowels, which at first glance are sort of totally boring technical features, but they tell the human story of how these buildings were built.
These are definitely kind of relieving art, really. It's flat relieving art. But have you looked into the relieving lintels where there's no real, compression taking place? It's more of a beam situation.
So the big place that these show up is, so those are sort of where you put a flat arch in place of a beam. We have some really beautiful examples of them in the Forum in Pompeii, and they're common in Roman architecture. The place that these show up in a big way is in Hellenistic fortifications, that when you built a city gate that you wanted to shut with a strong pair of doors, you wanted a strong spanning component that you could then put a tower on top of. They could take that weight, but you could also shut with a square door. And so we have Hellenistic fortifications that are most of our examples of Hellenistic flat arches. But those are a little bit difficult to date, these Hellenistic fortification systems. And by the around 200 BC, we have a reference to this system of construction in Philo of Byzantium, who mentions flat arches. His recommendation is for fortification walls and also in granaries, that you wanted to get as much wood out of the construction of a super combustible granary as you could. And so making beams out of stone rather than wood is essential. And so we've sort of known about these, but this is our first sense of this integration of these features behind the surface of sort of the aesthetics of formal architecture in the Greek.
Some of the examples I've seen are at a olive oil factory in Tunisia,
Uh-huh.
some nice ones, and then Egyptian examples, and also 19th century recommendations on stone construction too. So that concept is, I think, is more widespread than the flat arch, the really big element. This is fascinating.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you. This is a fascinating topic. We need another hour, but I wanted to go back to the propylaea
Yes.
because if I'm not mistaken, the architects were nervous enough about the architrave that they embedded an iron beam in it for the first time ever. I'm not sure if it's on both sides of the propylaea or whether this particular, which is the east elevation, is the one that has the traces of the beam in it. But whether that was ever done again, I'm just curious whether that embedded iron beam was something that was ever repeated.
So this is a feature of the interior Ionic colonnade inside the main hall. I wish I had a slide of it, but we have chalk and chalkboard. So, so these are. Oh, I gotta be careful drawing in front of all of you, but well, you get the point. And slipped into the architraves on top of the Ionic colonnade, there's a channel with a lip. I'm exaggerating it here because so that they could put in essentially a springy iron bar on top of this, because then in laying the coffered ceiling, and the propylaea has one of the most impressive coffered ceilings of the ancient world with 6-meter spans entirely out of marble that survived until the 17th century. They have to put one beam here, and then there's sort of one beam here, and then another beam here. And so it's the same principle of they know that a beam is weakest at its midpoint or is under the greatest amount of stress at its midpoint. And they're trying to get the weight off of the center of the beam. And a thing that's interesting about this system, which in a way, it's different than, say, reinforced concrete. What they're just doing is they're putting one beam on top of another beam, is that actually sort of the line of these ledges where the beam rests is actually only part of the way across the span. So it's, again, like our early flat arches, the relieving device still lands on the beam, and they're just trying to get weight off of the center of the beam. And so it's this sort of system of partial distribution. So this is, of course, so exciting to see iron used in a structural capacity in ancient architecture. There's a great old article by William Bell Dinsmore on evidence of iron. Some of them are contested. He identifies iron. I think most people think it's now wood in the foundations of the Theban treasury at Delphi. We have it in the temple of Zeus at Acragas over the Telamons. They've got reinforcing iron bars. And we actually still have one of these structural iron bars in situ low in the walls of the Erechtheion. There's a sort of channel underneath the north porch so that people could get in and clean out there's a kind of well in the north porch that allows you to look down into the bedrock where there are cuttings where they're natural feature that may represent, the marks of Poseidon's trident or Zeus's thunderbolt. And there's a channel under the wall that allowed you to get to it. And there's an iron bar in that block as well. So we see experimentation with this, but it drops out in favor of things like flat arches, including in the solutions of ceilings. We start to get coffered ceilings in the Roman period. We still have it in situ at the temple of Zeus at Izonoi, where they're building the coffer slabs are in the shape of flat arches. over the colonnades to relieve this exact problem. Now,
Thank you so thank you so much for enlivening the phrase Lewis irons in a way that I did not know was possible a decade ago. But seriously, this was really riveting. And on the one hand, your talk, I think, offers a corrective to this narrative we've had about this specific architectural technique, and how, as you close your talk with this enticing invitation that hunting season is open to go look for further instances of this technique in the Greek world. But on the other hand, I see this, and you can reference this at the beginning with the 1873 Tectonic der Hellenen. I'm interested in the ways you might see this as an opportunity to what other moments in the petrified narratives, forgive me, must we rewrite about classical architecture? And as you wrap up your first monograph project, might you speculate, not just are we looking for examples of this specific technique, but what other moments in the reception of the story of classical architecture need a little tweaking, corrective, deossifying, and so on and so forth. Now I'm mixing my metaphors.
thank you for all these compliments and this question about my second book. She's a plant. No, not just there's a passage that I love that I'm working on for my next book, which is about ancient stonemasons. That I came to from this project, where Seneca is laughing at or is ridiculing the ways Hellenistic historians wrote about innovation in the crafts. And he says, if you read Posidonius, this Hellenistic historian based in Alexandria, who's sort of collating texts in the library, he says that Democritus of Abdera invented the arch. And he goes, that's absurd. Clearly it was some clever builders who made it. And then he says, is it Heraclitus invented the potter's wheel? And which Greek philosopher invents glass blowing? And he said he would shake if he even saw the furnace where they blow glass, and he's laughing at the sort of tradition in in antiquity. He's pointing out for ridicule a tradition that emphasizes sort of that key inventions were always made by sort of great intellectuals whose names are known. And he makes the point that there are many anonymous craftspeople who worked on these techniques for a long time. And he lays out a paradigm for a kind of a different anonymous history of craft techniques and the transmission of craft ideas. And I think this is an essential paradigm for sort of tracing how workers moved around and cross-pollinated design ideas in the ancient Mediterranean. And the issue of the arch, which has sort of long been contested, as to when is it introduced to Greece, or it shows up in Greece in the 4th century BC. We, of course, have it in Egypt and Mesopotamia millennia earlier. How does that transmission take place, et cetera? But I think that there are other kinds of structural concerns, particularly the use of arches as sort of buttressing features, which we see, for example, in the back wall of the Stoa of Eumenes in Athens, that are part of this history of sort of structural ideas that is out there for us to write.
First of all, thank you. Last semester, I learned about the notorious problem of the triglyph not lining up on the corner, on the interior next to the corner. Do you think, or in your studies of your buildings that you were looking at, did you find that was more of a problem, or do you think that it was less of a problem given the segmental pieces of triglyph and metope structures?
So this is a good question. How does this fit into perhaps the most important problem in the Doric order? And it's worth pointing out, Vitruvius, when he tells us this at the beginning of book 4, when he describes the issue of the Doric order problem, he pegs it to 3 architects who were active in Asia Minor. The first of them, Pythios, in the mid-4th century BC, then Hermogenes around 200, Arcesius, we can't chronologically place exactly, that these writers based in Ionia started writing polemics about how the Doric order that had functioned perfectly well for 200 years for making beautiful buildings was flawed and defective, as in his terms, for the inharmonious space, and restrictive, he says, placing of triglyphs and metopes. And I think it's interesting to see this in context of these writing criticisms in ancient architectural treatises. Because, as you'll see, where you can hide these joints is predetermined by the spacing of the frieze elements. If the builders wanted to stretch where they put the joints to cover the entire span, they'd have a problem because it would have to go through the metopes. This is something that completely did not concern the Roman builders of the Basilica Aemilia. And so I think it's useful to see the emergence of that criticism, that the corner contraction problem that the builders of the 6th and 5th century were grappling with clever solutions to, that's a problem and that is sort of a source for criticism. That really emerges in the context of builders trying to use the Doric order to do new things, to wrap the Doric colonnades into increasingly complicated structures, internally facing peristyles and rotundas that face inward and the like, that caused problems. And I think the idea that they're trying to hide new structural systems inside the frieze sort of goes with this issue, the rise of criticisms that the Doric order was sort of too restrictive of a design idiom. I think that's in the background here a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this fun talk, a very lively talk. I was struck by how you talked about these masons and their work as being a little bit experimental and ad hoc, even. They're trying to problem solve on the spot, it seems. And there's very much a sense of trial and error. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. And I also wanted to ask if there might have been some anti-seismic qualities to these solutions, right? If they're trying to counteract forces of nature like earthquakes, perhaps, and if that might have been a motivation, some of these solutions.
All right. So the first question, so let me bracket anti-seismic and talk a little bit about trial and error and experimentation first, and then I'll come to anti-seismic. The issue of trial and error as, how they figured things out is so important. And I start my ancient engineering class with a passage from Philo of Byzantium's Bella Poetica, where he talks about the construction of catapults in the Hellenistic period. These huge sort of portion catapults that shot giant spears. And he says, some people will build these and they think that they followed the instructions precisely in how heavy the projectile is and, how tight the strings are. And some of these will shoot very far and others won't. And he says that, by making tiny adjustments to the formula of how one of these things work, many tiny adjustments can lead to, big problems and big differences. And he says that if you don't understand the idea, the sort of this Aristotelian term, the true reasons for why this kind of machine works, stick to the recipe. That's his advice. And of course, it's a book with just a whole list of proportions for how to build catapults. And he has this great line where he says, at the end, he says, scale is the biggest problem. That, a catapult of one size, you don't just sort of double everything and get something that works at a different scale. And he lays out a model for experimentation. And the Greek word is peira, learning by experience. And this is sort of key to his paradigm. And he says that over the period of the 3rd century BC, over 100 years, investment by the Ptolemies paid off and that they learned how to make good catapults. And in fact, it's the key passage for us, actually, for optical refinements, for understanding stylobate curvature, because he says, the very first Greek temples, they didn't look so good. He said, builders thought that things that they had made straight, they stepped back and they look at them and they didn't look right. And so only by adding and subtracting here and there did they make things look correct. And of course, that's our sort of thumbnail sketch of the invention of these curvature features. But it's key for laying out this paradigm of structural experimentation and this sort of push and pull between intellectual excitement about structures, about machines, et cetera, and what we might characterize, I suppose, as conservatism, of what Philo, says is sort of sticking to the recipe if you don't understand how it works. Of course, they didn't have the analytical methods for understanding the forces at play in these structures, that doesn't even show up really until Galileo. So, absolutely, this is important. Anti-seismic features, we see some, the way they lock certain blocks together. I think some of the, people try to make clamps that they're putting into blocks anti-seismic. That's not what the clamps are for. That's just to prevent gaps from being created in the annual expansion and contraction of blocks due to temperature. But yeah, there's a small chapter in Mary Christine Hellman's History of Greek Architecture. It's 2 pages on anti-seismic accommodations. It's one of the features, but one of many. I mean, they were concerned about water. They were concerned about snow loads. They were concerned about all kinds of things that could happen to your building. Yeah.
We'll take one more question.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it a lot, and I also look forward to this summer. I guess one thing that kind of stood out to me as you're presenting is, like, with the kind of standard, I guess, semicircular Roman arch, you have kind of the architectural expression of it, but you also have the, I guess, the structural, like, use of it that's sometimes hidden, which is what this seems to be more analogous to. But today, I guess, especially in neoclassical architecture, you see a lot of these flat arches that are used almost as a replacement for trabeated systems. And here it's still incorporated, regardless of which part it's in, into this larger entablature. I guess, is there like a direct link between these kind of integrated systems and then the standalone flat arches?
So, I mean, what's interesting is the story of our first Greek arches, our vault that we have in Macedonian tombs. They're buried, they're underground, they're for tunnels, they're for entranceways to stadiums, they're for tombs, they're for things he wanted to put a lot of weight on. They created great spans and great interior spaces, but there is not an integration of the semicircular form into the overall aesthetics of formal facade design. It takes a while for that to be integrated. We have some standout monuments. There's simply a freestanding arch that is an entrance to the Agora Priene, which may be one of our first examples from the late 4th century of, an arch that is proud to be an arch. And Klaus Dornisch, there was an architectural historian who wrote Die Griechische Bogentor, the Greek arched gateway, about fortification systems. And he was particularly interested in these fortification gateways as sort of the first examples of formal buildings that make a feature out of semicircular arches as a design feature in their construction. Flat arches, even used as lintels, which we have many examples of in the Roman period, they stick to, in many ways, the trabeated aesthetic conventions, where they have, the fascia that we see of an Ionic door frame, for example. None of the sort of excitement that you get with Giulio Romano, where he gives you a trabeated form and then, it has a big bulging keystone in the middle of it, and he's playing with the integration of trabeated and arcuated aesthetics. That will have to wait until mannerism, which is beautiful in its own right.